Hello, everyone. Before I get started talking on a little bit of chemistry and organic nitrogen, I wanted to start off with a story. So in the summer of 2016, I moved from my home overlooking the beautiful Puget Sound and moved cross-country to Virginia, specifically to the Chesapeake Bay and the York River Estuary, where I started graduate school at FIMS. And during my first year of graduate school, I was super busy learning about this new ecosystem and how it supports the community here in Virginia. And after my first year of grad school, I went back home and I was super excited to tell my family about everything that I had learned. And I was drinking my coffee with my mom, just chatting about life, adjusting to being in Virginia, and the big question came up. What are you going to be studying for graduate school? And so me being super excited, turned to my mom and said, can you hear me? I'm going to be studying urea. And like everyone here, my mom just started laughing at me, and then she proceeded to completely horrify me by asking, honey, you're getting a degree in marine science. Why are you studying pee? Which I had to sit down and explain to her, actually, urea is a very important nutrient source. So if you get anything from my talk today, I hope it's that you appreciate the role urea plays in our coastal ecosystems. So for some of those people here who may or may not be aware, nutrients can be an important food source for our phytoplankton communities. So they can include compounds like phosphate, metals, different nitrogen compounds, some of which I have listed here. But what can happen sometimes is when we get an influx of nutrients, we can get an influx of phytoplankton. And some of those plankton can even form harmful algal blooms, which can have negative consequences for our ecosystems, causing fish kills and low oxygen levels. As a biogeochemist, I'm interested in the nutrient component of this problem. Which nutrients are supplying the phytoplankton that may or may not support the formation of blooms. Specifically, I am interested in nitrogen. So some of you may have heard nitrogen and nitrogen nutrients being discussed in papers and different talks. What you are normally hearing about is inorganic nitrogen. This is ammonium, nitrate, and nitrite, which they are important nutrient sources. However, they are not the only form of nitrogen that's in the water column. There's a whole nother group of nitrogen called organic nitrogen. So classically, this organic nitrogen are compounds that have both nitrogen and carbon in them. And this is a bit of a black box. We know some of the compounds that are in this group, like urea. It also includes amino acids, proteins, these big nasty humic acids, and some compounds that we haven't identified yet. So these two different groups of nitrogen are sometimes hard to keep track of. So since we're near lunch, I have an analogy that will maybe help you guys keep them straight. So I like to think of inorganic nitrogen as sort of ready-made pasta. It's an easy-to-use, readily available food source. The phytoplankton love it. They're going to eat it all up. And traditionally, researchers have focused on this form of nitrogen food sources. However, organic nitrogen is a little bit more complicated. When you first look at it, you might not necessarily see it as a food source. And over the last few decades of research, we've realized that phytoplankton bacteria have the enzymes or the right tools to turn this organic nitrogen into a food source. And so there's been a growing body of research and interest into organic nitrogen. And over this time period, we've learned a lot about where organic nitrogen can come from. For example, it can come from natural excretion and regeneration processes, so zooplankton letting urea out into the water, or bacteria breaking down more complex compounds. Like my mom was initially touching on, it can also come from wastewater, and it can also come from agriculture, where urea-based fertilizers are on the rise globally. Now, for me as a researcher, I'm interested in this interaction between the nutrients and the phytoplankton themselves. And so I set out to do research in our local York River, looking how different nutrient sources are used throughout the water column throughout the year. I focused on different nitrogen sources, including our traditional inorganics, ammonium and nitrate, but I also looked at a few forms of organics, including urea. So in order to do my research, we use stable isotopes to do nutrient uptake experiments. Now, we're getting close to lunch. I'm not going to bore people trying to explain stable isotopes. But one way to think about stable isotopes is kind of like a chemical tracker. So kind of like Dan is tagging his cobia, we're using an isotopically labeled form of a nutrient. We add it to the phytoplankton community, and then from there, we can track how it goes into the phytoplankton, collect samples, and then we can calculate a rate of how much those different nutrients are used. So this is just a snapshot of some of the data that I collected in 2018. I have a pie chart here showing the total measured nitrogen uptake for the different substrates I looked at. So here in gray, we have inorganic nitrogen, so our yummy pasta, and it contributed to about 77% of total uptake during June of 2018. We also have the organics that I looked at, and you can see that urea is about 17% of the total uptake. So it's still a good chunk of the uptake, but it's not what the inorganics are. Now, when we look at August of 2018, we can see a big shift with your urea now accounting for almost 60% of our total uptake. And when we look at these 2 months together, we can see, okay, urea and organic nitrogen can be an important nutrient source. But what we can also see is that seasonality matters. And as we're going through the data, this actually makes sense because in the Chesapeake Bay and in this region, we tend to see a decrease in the availability of inorganic nitrogen at the end of the summer. So this red bar here is showing August when I saw the high uptakes of urea. And I'm still processing my data, and there was not a bloom the year that I did my data, but there are some other researchers who are finding that uptake of organics such as urea might play a role in the initiation of harmful algal blooms. So I still have a lot more work to do on studying both urea and nutrient cycling, but I hope you all get that organic nitrogen is not a laughing matter. Thank you.